Hello and welcome to the Podecito podcast. I am your host, Will469. If you are anything like me, you just might happen to be a big fan of the 2003 show Las Vegas. Now, we just happen to be in this sort of serendipitous time because Las Vegas, after all this time, has finally found a home on a streaming service, Peacock, which has its good notes and its bad notes. But one of the good notes is that I actually get to bring this podcast to the world, a podcast I've been thinking about and sitting on for a long time. And for various reasons, haven't had a chance to get to it, and there's no day like today, there's no time like now. I wanted to do this a long time ago when the only way to watch it was via DVD, which at a certain point got very expensive, and we can talk about those reasons in a little bit. Now it's on streaming service, and I think now is a good time so that it's a bit more shareable with more people. It was also on TNT for a long time, so some of you may not have been riding with the show when it first debuted in September 2003, but caught it in reruns alongside shows like Charmed and such off TNT. Now you get to see it on Peacock itself. A little bit about me, I've been a big fan of the show really since just after the first season. I won the DVD on a radio contest, was going through a bad, terrible time in my life, had a whole bunch of time on my hand to just sit and sulk and be depressed and just want my mind to wander in different places, and had this DVD in my hands. I popped it in and I fell in love immediately. And my guess is a lot of your stories are something similar to mine. Las Vegas was on for 5 seasons, starred the talented Josh Duhamel, Nikki Cox, James LeJour, Vanessa Marcil, Marsha Thomason, and James Caan to start. Oh, and Molly Sims, of course. Gary Stark. Scott Thompson wrote and was executive producer of the show, and he really is the driving force behind a lot of what we love about this show. This podcast is going to be an episode-by-episode breakdown of the show that we love. We're going to go through all 5 seasons, the good, the bad, and the ugly. As much as I love this show, I know that there are some parts in it that I liked more than others. There are some things in it I liked more than others. There are some relationships I liked more than others. Oh yes, we're going to stir all those pots in this podcast. But right now, we're just going to go, we're going to break down the pilot a little bit. There's so much to get into. I compiled information from every source I had. I've had the Las Vegas DVDs for years. I've actually had a few different incarnations of them. I got another recent version of them off of Amazon to watch and take more notes on because I wore my originals out. There's also the Peacock setting, and if you can find them on the internet in some places where they may or may not have permission to be, you might be able to find an original broadcast version of Las Vegas. Now, you'll be able to see that because it'll have the Peacock logo on it. I compile my notes from as many places as possible because one of the things that is a problem with streaming service, and one of the reasons why Las Vegas wasn't on streaming services for so long, is rights issues, specifically music rights issues. And we get into some of those music rights issues from the very first episode. If you're watching on Peacock, there are a couple of different shots in the intro. We start with a dead body in the desert. We find out who this dead body is a little bit later, but we start with a dead body in the desert. We start with certain music with this dead body in the desert. On the DVD and in the original version, it's Ready, Steady, Go. A fantastic song. I love that song. It's been on my compilations ever since I heard it on the DVD, and it was actually pretty big back in the day. Terrific song. And it's still in the Peacock version. Luckily, the sun sets as we glide underneath an airplane at McLaren Airport. We get our first real whoosh as we whoosh past the Las Vegas welcome sign. Now, the whoosh was technologically amazing at the time. It was, I'm going to feel a little old while watching this because I was around and alive and able to ingest and understand media at the time and love it and enjoy it. I was, legally an adult when this came out. Some of you may not understand what's the big deal about the whoosh. Well, this was technologically something that was ahead of its time, specifically on TV. In the early 2000s, there was still very much a divide between television and movies, between the quality and the money thrown at television versus movies. And you could see that a lot of times with really the quality of certain effects, the quality of maybe props, a different level of writing, in part because with television it's very episodic. You had to draw things out over a season of at least 13 up to 22 or 24 episodes. And, with a movie, you have 90 minutes. There was this very heavy divide between TV and movies. That started to fade a couple years later, but one of the divides, like I mentioned, is in special effects. You did not see on television a whole lot of this whooshing technology where the camera zooms very rapidly past images that you can recognize, and it seems it's almost hyper real, right? It's obviously altered. It's obviously a special effect. It's obviously not how you would actually see it, but it's hyper real because you still feel like it could actually happen, at least in this universe. And this is the first part of building this universe in Las Vegas. We whoosh down the Vegas Strip, past Lady Liberty in New York, through to a taxi with beautiful girls on it. We go to Paris, Paris. Down the Vegas Strip again, we see Mr. Bunny Shoes. It's laying the groundwork for the show. We pass by Circus Circus. There's a paper that flies by that has McCoy Construction on it with actual, by the way, let's stop by on this paper. It actually has stories on it. Like, if you pause at the right moment, you would actually start to read a little bit of this paper. Somebody put work into this graphic that you would really only are supposed to barely recognize. You're not even really supposed to really ingest even the headlines. It's barely on the screen for most people to notice. But Uber fans like me, you could actually go back and you could actually see what's on the paper. So for instance, one of the headlines, Montecito team nabs ring of slot cheats. The other, McCoy Construction wins bid. And then you can see Packers win 20-14. I applaud the technical team for their work with the paper. One of the other benefits of the whoosh, you get to go from place to place in a very fast fashion. There's a great breakdown of the whoosh. However, this whoosh is extra special because we get to meet the crew. And we start with Mike Cannon, played by James LeJour. James LeJour is one of my favorite actors, period, point blank. Every time I see James LeJour in something, I will at least stop and watch, because I know James LeJour is going to be good at it. Even if what he's in may or may not, and I don't even know if I've ever seen him in something that isn't particularly good. I'd have to go back and think. The first time I remember seeing James LeJour was in the ABC, which moved to WB sitcom For Your Love with Holly Robinson Peete and Michelle Pfeiffer's big sister, Dee Dee Pfeiffer, who, for my money's on Dee Dee. Michelle's great. I'll take Dee Dee all the time. As well as Adafe Blackman, D.W. Moffat, Tamala Jones. That lasted for, how many seasons? Was it 3 or 4? It might have been 5. I want to say 4 seasons or so. Great show. That's the very first time I saw him. And and this is actually part of the reason why I fell in love with Las Vegas, because I managed to give it more of a shot than just popping into the DVD player and watching it. We get to, less than a minute or two in it, and there's James LeJour, and I'm like, yep, I'm watching this. I don't care what happens next. I'm watching. James LeJour's in it. It can't be bad. Mike Cannon, as those of you who are fans of the show know, is arguably, for my money, Mike is the coolest guy in the casino. I know Josh Duhamel, Danny, is supposed to be the head character, but for my money, Mike's the guy. Mike is the guy. Everybody knows Mike. Everybody loves Mike. Mike is the guy. Even when they try to make him not cool or try to throw him off his game, he still brings the heat. And that, I got to give all credit to James LeJour on that. He's just tremendous in this role. This is a great role for him. So we get to whoosh by Mike Cannon, and then we go into the casino, and who do we see but the lovely, beautiful, talented Miss Nikki Cox. Nikki Cox is another one who I've seen before she got this role. She was in The Nanny pilot, of all things, as one of the oldest daughter's friends. I guess, and she also had a career as a child actress. Like, she was in a whole bunch of stuff, including California Dreams, where she had a slight story arc where she was the girlfriend of Sly Sylvester Winkle and was arguably the best girlfriend for him, even though he ends up with Lorena later. Arguably the best girlfriend for him. But I first recognized her from Unhappily Ever After, which is where probably most people first recognized Nikki Cox. She was just incredibly talented and funny and, of course, attractive on that show. It was from the creators of Married with Children, essentially an extension of Married with Children. What if Al and Peg actually did go ahead with the divorce? Nikki Cox became incredibly popular, even though this show was really supposed to be for Stephanie Hodge, who played the mother, and Jeffrey Pearson, who played the father. It was really supposed to be a starring vehicle for them. But Nikki Cox got popular. Stephanie Hodge got mad. It wouldn't be the first, I think, or last time that happened with Stephanie Hodge, but that's a whole other thing. And she ended up leaving the show. So because, in part, it just became the Nikki Cox show. So much so that when Unhappily Ever After ended, WB actually did give Nikki Cox her own show called Nikki. Because why wouldn't you? She was amazingly stunning and the hottest new thing on the market, and everybody knew it. And WB at that point really needed something like that to try to jumpstart their whole network. In that show, she was, ironically enough, in Las Vegas as a showgirl, an aspiring dancer, showgirl with her husband, who was an aspiring wrestler, called the Crybaby. There's a lot of those in professional wrestling. That's a whole nother story. And now we get to see the lovely Marsha Thomason. Oh, be still my... This show just doesn't miss, does it? This show with the beautiful girls. Oh my goodness. We get Marsha Thomason, who, according to the DVD commentary, which is another great reason to get the physical media, the DVD, because you actually get to hear the commentary from Gary Scott Thompson and the crew. According to Marsha Thomason, she didn't have a nameplate on whatever British show she had been on, or title card, right? And this is the first one she ever got. And she was so excited about that. She really wasn't even supposed to have this role, but we can talk about that a little bit later on. Marsha Thomason plays, of course, the Ice Queen, Vanessa Nessa Holt. Just stellar performance. And you could tell in every time she's on screen, really after the first episode, that she's having the time of her life. The first episode, she is very in the Ice Queen role. And she does continue that when she needs to in the series. However, somewhere between episode 1 and 2, somebody said, okay, have fun. And you can see the joy for being around her cast members on screen with her. And it's just incredible and magic to watch. Going back a little bit, Gary Scott Thompson said that he had that dead man in the desert image in his head for 15 years. And originally in his head, it was supposed to be in a graveyard of slot machines. But NBC said, no, we're not going to do that. I'd actually kind of like to see the slot machine graveyard, if I'm being perfectly honest. But I'm sure, worst case scenario, that was a budgetary issue. In the first part of the script, everything is as scripted, according to Gary Scott Thompson. He wanted to make a mini movie every week, and that really is what Las Vegas is. All of the shots are done at the Mandalay Bay, at least for the pilot, and there's a couple other shots that you'll see a little bit later in the first season that's at Mandalay Bay before their full set is actually built into the second season. Whoosh past Marsha Thomason, up the elevator. That's a great whoosh up the elevator. That's a great whoosh through the dining cart into the hotel room, and there you see two people on bed having sex. You get to see the hands go all the way down the body, the rose on the lower back. It's not quite a tramp stamp. It's over to the hip. And Molly Sims on the commentary asked if you can see her boobs in the reflection on the screen. Gary Scott Thompson says no. If you actually kind of, yeah. But out of the elevator comes some henchmen. We don't know who these people are. We're assuming maybe mob. They're all in suits. You see the side of James Caan's head. What an intro that is for the legendary James Caan. Godfather. Come on. Come on, Sonny Corleone. Come on. That's all that should be said. That's all that should be said. But for you younger kids, the dad from Elf. What more is there to say? James Caan is just amazing. He plays Big Ed DeLine, the head of security for the Montecito. He is just an incredibly strong figure on this show, an anchor, really, especially on a show like this with a cast that's really full of young people. Now, obviously, there's a lot of really experience by the time you get to this show, right? Josh Duhamel's done soaps. Vanessa Marcel's done soaps. Nikki Cox has had a whole career before this. James LeJour has had a whole career before this. But they're all still young, especially compared to James Caan, who's obviously older than the rest of the crew and has a lot more and deeper, wider range of acting skills. He's got the gravitas to really anchor this series. And you see that with good casts of young people. There's usually a good cast of older actors with some experience, with some gravitas to balance out the show. For an example, I'll give you that 70s show. Kurtwood Smith was a great anchor for everybody else that he was playing around, right? Deborah Jo Rupp, a great anchor with everybody else they were playing around. So you get that here with James Caan, and especially with because you need that. You need a straight man, and especially in this first episode, he's very much a straight man with an edge. So Big Ed is walking down the hall, Molly Sims and Josh Duhamel. We don't know who these people are just yet, but then the card goes in, Molly turns her head.
Hi, Daddy.
Daddy.
And there you see Big Ed and Paulie looking over Josh Duhamel's face for the first time like he can't believe it. Great way to intro the cast. Let's talk about Paulie here for half a second. Paulie is an unfortunate casualty of how good other cast members are. Because Molly Sims and Marsha Thomason really weren't supposed, like their roles apparently, according to Gary Scott Thompson on the DVDs, really wasn't supposed to be as permanent as they were, as big as they were, and Paulie really was supposed to be on the show as a regular. Thinking about this, I don't know how that would have worked with the balance. I like the idea of a Paulie because he's somewhat more tied to older Vegas, even though Ed is tied to older Vegas. But as I think about it, as I've thought about it over the years, I don't know. I like Ed more not needing a Paulie behind him. I like Ed more not needing that backup to follow him all up and down Vegas. Now, I guess maybe realistically, a guy like that would need backup, right? Like, or somebody around him for protection. I don't know. It adds a bit more to the mystique of Big Ed that, you know, he could let Paulie I like to think in my head canon Paulie retired after this first episode. Let's talk about this theme song. In the network version, this is another clue on how you'll see a network version. If you just happen to be floating around a part of the internet that has it, even though they probably shouldn't, if it's a network version, it'll have A Little Less Conversation by Elvis Presley, not the newer one with JXL, which came out around this time. The more club version, not that mix. The original Little Less Conversation is the one that plays on the network version, including the TNT version, as well as the first episode of every season on the DVD. Only the first episode. I guess it was a rights issue. They didn't want to put it in all the other episodes. I don't know. However, in all the other episodes, we get the Charlie Clouseau song, Let It Ride. Charlie Clouseau of Nine Inch Nails did the background music and a lot of the music for Las Vegas, a lot of the production stuff for Las Vegas, and a lot of other shows. Charlie Clouseau made a killing doing TV music. And by the way, that is a whole industry. You have Gary Portnoy who did it. You have W.G. Snuffy Walden who did it. And Charlie Clouseau found his way there, especially with a lot of the cooler shows from the early 2000s. And some movies, too. He did some very good work. I followed and have a few of the songs that he's written for some of these productions that came out as theme songs. They're fantastic. They're amazing. So Charlie Clouseau does Let It Ride, which you will hear on every other episode after the pilot if you get the DVD. You will also hear it on the Peacock. You will also hear it on international showings of Las Vegas. Again, rights issues with a little less conversation. I personally love Let It Ride. For my personal money, just my personal opinion, I like Let It Ride more than I like A Little Less Conversation. In part because, and I remember around this time, A Little Less Conversation started to be a little played out. Because everyone put A Little Less Conversation on a whole lot of shows and movies and commercials, especially if it had anything to do with gambling or cards or Vegas. They loved that song. They loved it around that time. It was mega. And as much as I like that song, I like A Little Less Conversation a little less than Let It Ride. I really enjoy Let It Ride. I really enjoy the DVD music that you get, the menu music on the DVD. No guilt, no shame, no pity. I love that song. Can't find it anywhere. I love that song. So I'm a fan of Let It Ride, but A Little Less Conversation is not a bad song. The very first thing we see is Nikki Cox blowing on some dice, and why wouldn't you? That is a great hook in 2003. That is a fantastic hook. The dice go down the crap table, and you see my favorite shot of the entire show, if we're being perfectly honest, certainly of the intro, after the dice finish rolling. The panoramic, not panoramic, the kind of the whirly bird. It's not whirly bird. It's not panoramic, because panoramic to me seems like you need a wider view. It's a shot that wraps around Ed and Danny with the lights underneath them. You got some shadows. I like to call that, they had like the kind of Triple H lighting. I'm a wrestling fan. For those of you who know Triple H, Paul Levesque, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, when he first turned back into a bad guy after being with Degeneration X, when he first became a bad guy again in 1999, he started coming out to this almost futuristic sort of intro where he'd stop in the entranceway and lights would shine on him from different directions that made him and whoever he was accompanied to the ring with look almost as if they were androids in the case in a lot of these big action movies that were being brought to life suddenly. And that's kind of the framing that you get with Big Ed and Danny. And that shot wrapping around them staring off, looking into the casino like it's theirs and they're in full control of it. I love that shot. That is my favorite shot. And then we go back to the Mandalay Bay and we get the intro here, and it's fantastic. Marsha Thomason tossing the cards with the... Did she have a perm in that shot and only in that shot? I'm not sure. But she did. And we get the intros. The intros are fantastic. The credits have a very 60s, 70s vibe, which goes with the Little Less Conversation music. It reminds me of shots that you would see in the old Hawaii Five-0 intro. It reminds me of shots you would see in Magnum P.I. in the 80s, which is a show that Gary Scott Thompson references on the DVD commentary, particularly with their voiceovers and how well they did them. The voiceovers, we see the mechanic here with Danny as he's sort of narrating the first at least few episodes of the season. That wears off and fades away pretty quickly. This was in an era where voiceovers were making a comeback in 2003. Scrubs was doing voiceovers and did them for the remainder of the original series. And I think they tried to bring him back for the other series as well. I can't remember much about that 9th season. Anyway, voiceovers were making a big comeback in this era, especially as you got more producers and creators who were thinking like Gary Scott Thompson was and wanted to make their show seem more cinematic. But the intro was very 60s, very 70s, very 80s, very that kind of older school style, which fit in with not only the intro, but with the show itself. Las Vegas would, to me, sort of almost resemble a show like The Love Boat, where you had this essential crew of people that were running this now stationary sort of plot of heaven where all these different guests could come in and have all these sort of different type of adventures every week. And sometimes it would affect the cast, sometimes it wouldn't affect the cast, but that doesn't necessarily matter because you could have all these sort of fantastical adventures every single week in this one location because it's a destination type show, and you could have all these grand adventures. So we go back to the hotel. Ed's goons put their guns away because they detected a weapon in there. Delinda says,
"Well, he did have a weapon, Daddy. Just not the kind you're thinking."
Which is, oh, wow. Jeez. A couple questions, though. If she was staying at Danny's place, why did they have to go to the hotel room? And I'm just answering my own question because there's a whole reason why she's in Vegas in the first place. She was off studying somewhere, but she got bored. And I'm sure Delinda Deline in the first couple of episodes gets bored very easily. We all know what I'm talking about. Delinda Deline. It comes up, I think, in the very next episode. We all know what I'm talking about. Delinda gets bored easily. She's the type of girl who gets bored easily. Actually, maybe not the next episode, but it's probably episode 3 or 4. She gets bored easily. So, of course, going over to Danny's place isn't enough. She has to have Danny break into a suite in the hotel. And, of course, Danny's going to do it because he's just a goofy 20-something-year-old kid, and she's Molly Sims, for crying out loud. Now, Molly Sims, according to the commentary, got the role because of Gary Scott Thompson's wife. Gary Scott Thompson then sent a link to Molly Sims' Sports Illustrated pics to NBC. NBC asked him, can she act? And he said, do we care? And lo and behold, for Delinda Deline, she actually can act. Delinda Deline is a character. You love Delinda. You don't ever really hate Delinda. You get believably and affably frustrated with the flightiness of Delinda Deline at places, but you never hate her. You never hate her for it. You just kind of she's got a charm to her. And again, just like I mentioned with Mike Cannon, a lot of that might just be Molly Sims. A lot of that might be the writing. Paulie is taking Danny back to surveillance. And Paulie, like I mentioned, is one of these characters that's going to disappear after this pilot. He's one of 2 actually cast casualties. The other one really is the Iceman. Now, who's the Iceman? Well, the Iceman was supposed to be Nessa's character. But Nessa came in and she was too good, and then the Iceman became the Ice Queen. We'll get into the Iceman a little bit later. As Danny goes into security and surveillance, he's instantly met with military reference by Big Ed DeLine. Now, Gary Scott Thompson mentions that they outgrew the military references, and I kind of agree. The show flows better without it. And it also flows a little bit better when, even though Danny is the main protagonist, we get more access to seeing more of the casino and more of these characters outside of Danny. Danny being the whole glue that holds everything together is great, but him being the one with the voiceover doesn't quite work for a show like Las Vegas, as opposed to the way it works for a show like Scrubs, also on NBC at the time. Here we get a security guy doing exposition down on the security floor of our big cheater and of Mr. Bunny Shoes. Now, initially I'm like, is that Mitch? Initially I was like, is that Mitch? He sounds like Mitch. Not quite Mitch. We don't see Mitch just yet. But we do see a bit of exposition. Danny then is asked by Big Ed, I'm asking you as head of security, do you... This is my Big Ed impression, by the way. This isn't NBC, don't come after me. I know my impression is good. Now, do you sleep with women whose background you don't know? Because if you do, that becomes a big security risk. And then Danny says no, and then Ed replies with, so it's just my daughter then. Ah! What a shot. He walks right into that one. Danny then talks about how he wants to leave for a double shift, but then is thrown on all these different tasks, which makes me wonder, how is he still standing at all? Now, Big Ed again mentions you didn't seem like You didn't seem like you needed rest 20 minutes ago. Another great shot. However, Ed knows, and this is really him kneeling him, because as a former 20-something-year-old male myself, I will tell you, you can be dead tired in your 20s. And if Delinda Deline, fellas, comes to you after a 48-hour shift and you say, or after a 24-hour shift and you say, nah, I think I'll pass. After a double shift, you say, after a 16-hour shift, nah, are you gonna say no? You're not gonna say no. You're not gonna say no. Especially now with energy drinks as big as they are, you're not gonna say no. You're gonna grab yourself a fistful of Red Bulls and you're gonna go find yourself a sweet. Big Ed welcomes him to the family and sends him off on his errands for the day, finding out who the cheater is, what's the deal with Mr. Bunny Shoes, what's up with the whale that's missing, what's up with Mr. and Mrs. Johnson for their 30th anniversary, and the cowgirl exhibitionist in the elevator. Now this, according to Garrett Scott Thompson, is a story of a young starlet around that time who really was doing stuff like this. Now, I'm sure I looked it up back then. I'm sure I looked it up. And there was an old Las Vegas message board. And I'm going to be actually, for whatever I can find in the Wayback Machine on this board, because it does still exist on the Wayback Machine and some of the pages are still open. So I am, throughout the podcast, going to be using that as a reference point. I haven't been able to find anything about this particular starlet exhibitionist, but I'm sure it was a topic of discussion back then. The message board was LasVegas-theseries.com was what it was. And it was, I loved that message board. This is the message board days, kids. Yes, I love that message board. It was a fantastic message board. Anybody listening to this from the old Las Vegas-the-series message board? Yes, I'm still the same Cyril 469. I was Cyril 469 on that too. But the exhibitionist cowgirl, according to Gary Scott Thompson, like a lot of the people on this particular episode, matter of fact, most of the stories are based on real people, right? The cheater is based on a real person. Mr. Bunny Shoes is based on a real person. The exhibitionist cowgirl is based on a real person. Mike Cannon, being an engineer who turns into a valet, is based on a real person. A lot of these are based on real people, real instances that have happened, that he found out in his discovery of Las Vegas and his research into all sorts of different stories that can be told on the Las Vegas show. Fast forward, Danny is running through the casino. He walks past the hookers at the end of the bar and he meets Mary, Nikki Cox, the girl next door, best friend since they were 2 years old. Each other's first kiss, each other's first everything, each other's first love. Now is not the time to talk about my idea of Danny and Mary. We'll get there. Danny reveals that Mary is not a hooker. However, in the original script, according to Gary Scott Thompson, Nikki Cox, yes, she was. Which changes the dynamic of the whole show. A lot of this changes the dynamic of the whole show. What if Paulie had stayed? What if Mary had stayed a hooker? And how much did that play in the tragic backstory that Mary ended up having, that we would find out in later episodes? Not even that much further down the series, but in later episodes. How did Mary get the tragic backstory to lead her into being a hooker? Did Gary Scott Thompson write her as a hooker and then create the backstory behind her so that she could be maybe more network friendly in 2003? Obviously, Nikki Cox liked the role. She said in the commentary that just reading the script and the way it was laid out, she knew that she wanted to be a part of it. What dynamic does that change for Danny and Mary in their backstory if Mary is a hooker now? All these questions. Now, of course, in Clark County, where Las Vegas is, hooking is not legal. So as much as Danny, again, this is 2003, as much as Danny may have known about the hookers, etc., realistically, they're not supposed to be on the premises conducting business. Same today. Yada, yada, yada. Things happen. People may not look in general directions for various reasons. And we'll actually see that later in the show. Not this episode, but in the show. as well. They mentioned Greg. Pay attention to that. They mentioned Greg. That's a little hint. You'll pick that up as we move along. So Danny talks to Mary for a little bit, looking for his whale, and Mary's date comes back, and that's when we all think that she's a hooker, but she's not. She's an executive director of parties and event coordinator. Danny gets to talk to Nessa. Here we get to hear from Marsha Thomason for the first time in the show, and her accent is just sublime, and it really got her the role. She initially read for Sam, and she read for Sam in an American accent. She read for Sam's assistant in a Cockney accent. Gary Scott Thompson is told that our girl Marsha is actually British. And so he runs out to her as she's leaving the audition and asks her to read it again in her British accent. Yada, yada, yada. The Ice Queen is born. I was talked about how we get to hear more of the playfulness later, but we actually get to hear it early on in this first bit, because here comes Marsha dropping the Ice Queen with the...
So when are you going to show me the sights of Vegas like you promised?
That's it. I'm in love. That's it. I'm in love. I'm in love. That's it. I don't need to... That's it. Come on. That's the finishing move. That's the tombstone pile driver in the middle of the ring. That's it. I'm in love. When are you going to show me the sights of Vegas? What an accent. What an accent. So Danny goes to find the big whale, and we hear him get a bit of exhibition from the butler, who, according to GST, Gary Scott Thompson, on the commentary, they had to ADR his voice in.
He was with some female companions and wanted the jacuzzi filled with Tattinger. 1990 vintage, $400 a bottle. I had to send guys all over town to get enough.
To drink?
No, to bathe in.
And they ADR'd him with a very famous at the time voice actor who did a lot of commercials. You heard him for the more refined commercials for more expensive cars like Lexus.
The Lexus December to Remember sales event.
Then we get to see Mike Cannon. We get to hear his exposition about his degrees, and once again, based on a real person. And the line that gets James LeJour the job.
Oh, Big Ed's daughter. Are you crazy?
Great line. Great line. And I'm telling you, Mike Cannon to me is he's the character. He's the guy. He's the guy on this show. Mike Cannon is the coolest guy on this show. He invites Danny to his house for a barbecue at the end of the episode, which we will see, and we will see some more casualties of the pilot episode. We'll get into that when we get into that. As Danny goes off to dinner with Big Ed and Jillian. Jillian, played by Cheryl Ladd. Folks, when it comes to beautiful women, beautiful, talented women on this show, Las Vegas, it starts with the heavy artillery, and they're not missing. They just hit after hit after hit. Legendary Cheryl Ladd, for crying out loud, coming in and playing Jillian DeLine, is amazing. Now I sat here and I watched this, and in repeat viewings, it really does occur to me, and this goes back to what I was talking about with Polly. Polly's just gonna sit there and watch Big Ed eat. And Big Ed and his family eat. So Paulie is Big Ed's bodyguard. But why does a guy like Big Ed need a bodyguard at that particular point? He's not like a lot of other big names in Vegas. He's got a CIA background. They sort of built him up as this old school, not quite, but almost super soldier. It makes him more intimidating that he doesn't need bodyguards around him. So then we go to the dinner scene with Big Ed and Jillian, waiting for Danny to come in. Apparently this was shot over Ghost Bar, and the club was hopping at 1 o'clock in the morning, and they somehow managed to do this without hearing the latest dubstep song bleeding into all the audio. Now, Delinda was originally supposed to be just a recurring character. And we talked about this a little bit before about some of the casualties of the show. Paulie was one of the casualties of the show, as was the guy who was supposed to be the Ice Man, who was originally supposed to actually be Danny's godfather. the character is supposed to be John Carlucci. In comes Marcia. When are you going to show me the sights? If I guess Danny and the Iceman is dead. So Delinda was supposed to be a recurring character. But in this scene, which has the great, just grape juice gulp by a young, nervous Josh Duhamel, which is so endearing, and it's really topped off by Cheryl Ladd doing the quick hand over her mouth embarrassment, sort of laughing at the just innocence of this kid. It's just great. She really does make that scene. But who also makes the scene is Molly Sims. Delinda the Line coming in to the track Voodoo Baby. Great track, which spans over all the places you can find it. If you can find Voodoo Baby, find it. It's a great track. I love it. The scene where she walks in and is doing the weird thing where she's got her purse but is putting on her jacket as she's walking, which if you watch it, and she says it in the commentary, is really a little bit clumsy sort of direction, but the network wanted her to have the coat on and GST wanted her to have the coat off, and so they compromised with her putting the coat on during the scene. Anyway, that got her the role. That got her the role. According to Gary Scott Thompson, he sent that scene in to the network execs, and she's a regular now. In this scene, we get a lot of exposition with Big Ed and Delinda sort of being more of a almost bratty girl, like almost a smarter version of a Paris Hilton. Not even really, because Paris Hilton, I don't think Paris Hilton had ever had much of a personality. She's just a flighty 20-something-year-old is Delinda, and but is somehow the daughter of one of the strictest guys maybe in the world. In this scene, we also get a little bit more into the family dynamic, and really I can kind of tell that Jillian was a bit of a Delinda back in the day, and that's where Delinda gets it from. At the end of the scene, Ed comes back to the table, talks about how they can't find the whale again because they did all these other different searches. And Danny says, you had the CIA look up his, and everybody at the table casts eyes on him like CIA is a forbidden word. You are never to say CIA out in public like that. With as far as Big Ed is concerned, at least in the pilot, they say CIA all the time after this. But that's one of those things that at the time almost seemed like that'll be another tick of Big Ed, is that they pretend like the CIA, that he wasn't in the CIA or whatever. But they end up playing that off differently later on. So Danny meets up with Mary again. That scene changed location because the location where they were actually originally going to film it had a ska band there all of a sudden when they actually went to go film it. And we get more exposition with Mary and Danny. Now, here's another difference here. There is different music in this scene when you watch it on Peacock. In this scene and in the scene that follows in the strip club, there's different music on Peacock than you'll find on the DVD version or I'm sure the original broadcast version. And this is another thing about the Peacock version. And I'll go on a diatribe about that a little bit later as we get closer to the end. But I notice it, and I notice it, of course, because I've seen the DVDs over and over and over again. A lot of people probably aren't going to notice it. And a lot of these instances, it probably isn't the biggest deal. It will be just later in this episode. So we get a bit more of exposition with Mary and Danny. Danny left the family business that his father and grandfather left him. And you hear a very interesting read of a line. And I don't know if this is as it was written or if this is a Nikki Cox thing. But she says,
You walked out on them, Danny, when they needed you most.
when we needed you most. She says we. You walked out on them when we needed you most. Which adds a little bit of something to the backstory of Mary and Danny. She's just the girl next door. She's just so... She looks just so sweet and innocent in this scene. Your heart... at this point, you don't even know what the backstory is. But your heart still breaks for her just by the expressions on her face and her fixing his tie and his lapel. She's always picking at him like a wife. And now's the time to talk about it. In the Las Vegas fan community, it was a big battle in the shipper section. Now, the message board was divided into different divisions, and one of the divisions was the shippers, where you could go and you could talk about your favorite coupling of characters, your favorite relationships on the show, whether they were actually written on the show or not. The big war was between the team that liked Mary and Danny together and the team that liked Danny and Delinda together. The team that liked Danny and Delinda together was called Team Dee D/D. That's their ship. The team that liked Danny and Mary together, well, they were called Team Derry, Danny and Mary. I am very strictly, unequivocally, unmovably Team Derry. I make no bones about it. You cannot move me from the position that Danny should have been with Mary at the end of this show. That Danny was always supposed to end up with Mary. For those of you who haven't seen the show, I don't know what to tell you. For those of you who have seen the show, you know how that actually ends. But as my stance, 10 toes down, it was supposed to be Danny and Mary. That's the relationship. Danny can have fun with Delinda. That's fine. But the end game is Dan. And on TV shows, you have this thing called an end game. The end game relationship is a relationship that you know is supposed to be the one that they're driving towards. You can't have Ross and Rachel be together the entire show. That doesn't create conflict in the relationship, especially on a show like that with a lot of these young 20-somethings, right? You can't really have that, especially as the main characters. There has to be some sort of conflict. Will they, won't they drives ratings. NBC loves the will they, won't they relationship, and Las Vegas originally aired on NBC. NBC loved the will they, won't they relationship since Sam and Diane in Cheers in the early 80s. It was a huge rating spike for them, and since then, really, if you go back in history, up until I don't even know when, almost all of their shows, specifically sitcoms, had to have a Sam-Diane dynamic, including even Cheers when Diane left. They still did it with Sam and Rebecca. Throughout all the must-see TV years, almost every show had a will they, won't they. Scrubs had JD and Elliot. Friends had Ross and Rachel. Caroline in the City had Caroline and Richard. They almost all had it. Frasier had Daphne and Niles. They almost all had it. And sure enough, Danny and Mary was Las Vegas's. Delinda was not supposed to be in game. If you watch this episode and you see the look in Nikki Cox's eyes, you cannot tell me that D&D was supposed to be in game. You just can't say it. You just can't tell me. And you can't tell me that D&D was supposed to be more genuine. Not than this. Not than Team Derry. And not to me. Now, this is one of those instances where I would love your input, but I'm 100% Team Derry. Anyway, like I said, there's different music in the strip club scene. This scene was shot at Crazy Horse 2. One of their PAs is the fat guy who gets up on stage at the end of it. Now, in this scene, Danny talks to the stripper, and he just happens to see Mr. Harmon's whale's lucky ring on her finger. And he then grabs it and looks at her and says, tells me, and she says, I don't have to, and he says, it is my business. In real life, that's not quite how that would go down, even if Danny knew everybody in the club like that. So Danny comes back to the casino, goes up to the surveillance room. Gary Scott Thompson in the commentary says that this surveillance room was more high-tech than the surveillance room they had at the time. From experience, I worked in a surveillance room or two a little bit after this show started, and not a Las Vegas casino surveillance room, but some for more local for where I am here in Los Angeles, not casinos, but businesses. And I can tell you, their surveillance, even in 2003, even though it wasn't digital, it was all analog. And they talk about this in a later episode. By analog, I mean videotapes, kids. Could be erased with magnets. As a matter of fact, you had to erase them with magnets. That was part of the job. I can tell you, their surveillance system was, in fact, as sad as it is to think, high tech for the time, because it was a lot more digital. Like I said, I worked in loss prevention and surveillance room a little bit after this, and part of the job was you take the security tapes, the older security tapes, I forget how long they kept them for. I think maybe it was a month, or I think it was maybe 3 months. You take those tapes and you erase them. You have this giant magnet that wipes them clean, and you run it over the videotape a couple times, and you reuse the videotapes. That was part of the job. So yes, they were in fact more high tech. However, this giant brick of a thing that Danny has in his hand as he goes back down on the casino floor to read RFID readings is ludicrous. Is just ludicrous. That looks like that looks like an old, not even radar. That looks like I don't even know what that looks like, an 80s style something. Even in 2003, that looks like it was ancient. And I can't imagine that actually doing anything, but maybe I'm wrong. Danny comes down to Mr. Bunny Shoes, who's playing alongside one of the Maloof brothers, who was perfectly fine with coming off a bit like a jackass in this scene, actually. Gosh, this guy stinks. Why am I playing with a bum? You know, he's a very famous billionaire, and I would imagine that very famous billionaires often think that about, even their accountant. So good on him for probably not even playing that much of an actual role. Danny's dad stops by the casino. This is another great bit of casting here. Danny's dad just plays ultra sincere. And the same way you understood where Delinda got a bit of her spunk from in Jillian, you can see where Danny gets his, not naivete, but almost aw shucksness from, if that makes sense. He gets it from his dad. Right on the money with how sincere he is. Right down to at the very end, where Danny asks what Mom would want for their 30th anniversary if she was still alive, and he says,
I'd hope she'd still want me, son.
oh my gosh, come on, is this, oh my gosh, what is this? Is this a commercial for Hallmark here? But it works. Even in the cynical townness that you can have for a place like Las Vegas, it works. It really does work. And you can see that lineage straight to Danny. Danny goes and meets Samantha Jane. Initially, we see her as Jane, the assistant to Sam, but Sam reveals herself to be Samantha Jane, played by Vanessa Marcil. Vanessa Marcil is a soap opera veteran at this point, and she is just a delight. A lot of times when in various episodes later on, you'll see the show is working well. The show is working fine. But then Vanessa comes into the scene and just steals it when there was no need to steal it. Every scene she's in, she brings it up to a different level, whether it's more energetic, whether it's her conniving, whether it's her sarcasm, whether it's her being this tough little spitfire. She brings so much to the show and really is just the nice accent ending capper, topper to the whole gimmick. She is fantastic in this role as Samantha Jane. And you really see that when she's firing off trying to negotiate with Danny about bringing Mr. Herman back, the whale, back to the casino for her short-term deal with the casino. And that also plays into the sort of maverick, freelance, play-by-my-own-rulesness of Samantha Jane Marquez. When they go back to the casino, the whale suite is taken by Mr. Bunny Shoes, though. And Sam and Danny have to go up and figure out a way to get Mr. Bunny Shoes out of the suite. Now, as you zoom in on Mr. Bunny Shoes in Mr. Herman's suite on the DVD, you hear a song called This Is It. This Is It was later in a movie called Jimmy and June. If you're looking for this song on YouTube, you have to look up This Is It as heard in Jimmy and Judy. Did I say June? Judy. Jimmy and Judy by Louis La Medica. This is one of those songs that if you go to Peacock, it's not there. They changed that song too. In that scene where Sam and Danny are trying to get Mr. Bunny Shoes out of the suite, you could tell that Sam actually looks at Danny differently when he's trying to convince Mr. Bunny Shoes to just walk away with his winnings. And for somebody like Sam, who is super cutthroat and all about money and all about the art of the deal, mostly, and we will see that later on in the series, that's an interesting turn, especially considering that at this point, nobody knew a lot of the stuff about these characters. But it was something about Vanessa Marcil that in that moment, that kind of looking at him like he might actually be sincere. He might actually be a nice guy. He might not just be this typical guy who was just trying to sleep with me while I was trying to sleep with him for information. So as Sam is dealing with a client on the phone and trying to figure things out, she opens up her PDA and Danny is putting the pieces together of how the cheater is doing it and with whom. He pieces together the bit about the valet all through the show who's been running around with a PDA. And let's talk about this valet with the PDA, even in 2003. There's no way. There's no way. Now, GST says that this whole scam is based on a real scam that somebody tried to run in Vegas but didn't get nearly as far as the cheater on this show. Here's the thing that I find so hard to try to figure out. It certainly wouldn't have been this obvious. A valet walking around with a PDA while actually working and moving cars and such, that doesn't work. With an earpiece in his ear, because Bluetooth technology really wasn't a thing back in 2003, that would not jive. That would not jive. Most jobs hated when you would have so much as an earpiece in your ear listening to the regular old radio or music or a CD or yes, CDs or a cassette, yes, cassettes, or an MP3, yes, MP3 players. They hated it. Most jobs hated it. Most jobs hated it. To the point where you could be disciplined, you could be fired for it, even if your job was just pushing papers, even if your job was sitting at a computer on a spreadsheet entering data. A lot of jobs hated that. You're going to tell me that casino valet is going to be allowed to not only have something in his ear, maybe you can get away with that, but a handheld video thing that he's staring at the whole time too? No, that's been a movie magic. Because there's no way, there's no way he had it out and visible like that constantly. However he was trying to do it, it couldn't have been like that. Maybe he was standing at the actual stand the whole time, but he couldn't have been driving cars in and out and still in front of his multiple versions of his boss and just get away with it. There's no way. Danny realizes the thing. He offers Mr. Herman the whale a deal if he's going to stick around. The cheater goes in for one more hand and offer to double up on his way out. And as he's doing this, another thing I always thought is this is how these fools get caught. Is the sucker got greedy? Like, at what point do you just walk away? 2003 money he has at this point as he's about to lose the money, $3.5 million. That is a ridiculous amount of money in 2003. Even if he has to share it with the valet, that's over $1 million each. In comparison to inflation numbers, that $3.5 million equals to about $5.8 million today. A ridiculous amount of money in 2003. They got greedy. They wanted to take the whole casino and thought they could get away with taking out the whole casino. At what point do you just walk away? Also, at what point does the valet not have a code? Do they not come up with a code word in case everything goes wrong? In case the guy at the table doesn't hear something back in a certain amount of time, or just hears a code word like, yeah, hit that sweet 9, sweet 9. Oh, the code word is sweet. He's caught. Time for me to leave. How's there no panic button? How's there no just automatic escape button at this particular point for these guys? But there isn't. He gets caught, and he goes all in 3.5. Now, at this point, Nessa's going to deal. Blackjack hand. Guy has 12, 5, and 7. Nessa shows a queen. He says, hit me. By the way, Marsha Thomason hated the way her nails looked as she pulled out that card. And the guy busts out with a king. He gets 22. He gets the old Jake Roberts 22 instead of 21. In the meantime, Danny goes back up to check on Mr. Bunny Shoes, who has gone back downstairs to the casino after Sam looks like she got him to switch rooms. And Danny said, oh, you didn't. She said, no. She had to send a picture to his family to make sure that they knew that he was all right. Here come Mr. and Mrs. Johnson again. In this scene, according to Gary Scott Thompson, was shot 2 ways. One way is the way that we get to see. And the other way is where Danny gives them advice and they go back to fighting again just because. And that would have been the funnier scene. However, the NBC exec, in one of the few times where a TV exec offers notes that actually pay off, that are actually good notes, says that he likes the scene where it works out at the end. Or Danny comes back and offers him a free dinner at the Venetian. And that really does help set the tone for the show. And that really did for me and for a lot of other people help bring in us as fans. Especially in a town like Vegas. You want to believe in the magic. At least back then you did. Vegas has changed a lot. Resort fees. But you want to believe in the magic. You want to believe in the cool. You want to believe in the luck. You want to believe in it all. And a show like Vegas, like Las Vegas, helps and made you believe in a lot of it. It was fantastic. It was a great show. And that scene was one of the reasons. And then pile that onto the other scene where Danny immediately goes to Mr. Bunny Shoes, who has about $40,000. Again, 2000's money. $40,000 today equals $66,000. Still about a year's salary, right? In a good job. For a bum to go from Social Security check to about a year's salary is good. Now, mind you, he had $1 million, and it's a good takeaway. Danny again does a good deed. He tells him to walk. He closes the table down. He tells him to walk away while he still has something to walk away with. It's the feel goodness of it. A long time ago, We Used to Be Friends plays as we go to the party at Mike's house. And everybody's there, including a couple of other casualties that we would not see later on in the show. So Paulie's there in the background. We will not see Paulie ever again. And Mike's wife and kids. Mike, at this point, had a wife and kids. And you saw a little boy and a little girl. And they were playing with a robot. He had a wife, kids, and robot. They were never mentioned, luckily. So they were easily written out of the show. They were never mentioned. So it was fine for him to not have to be single by episode 2. And you can see her in the background. Never mentioned again. In that scene, we hear a long time ago, We Used to Be Friends. And keep that in mind, please. As Danny is driving down the Vegas Strip going back home, he sees Mr. Bunny Shoes, who walks away with a clean pair of kicks now. He's got the bunny slippers, a brand new pair in his Montecito backpack, which is, by the way, a nice backpack. That's a nice touch, but he's got some clean kicks on him, man. He's got, I don't know if those some kind of metal on the bottom. I don't know if those are just steel or silver or what. Those are clean. Anyway, Danny goes into his ending epilogue as he drives down the strip, and we hear the first,
God, I love this town.
Great line. Love that line. God, I love that town too, or at least I did before the resort fees. And we hear a long time ago, We Used to Be Friends in the DVD version. We hear a long time ago, We Used to Be Friends in the original airing. We don't hear a long time ago, We Used to Be Friends in the Peacock version, which is a sin, a shame, and a travesty. And this is why not only am I Team Dairy, but I am Team Original Version if you can find it, and Team Physical Media DVD. And I hate to say that because all that's really going to do is drive the prices of the DVDs back up again. But if you really want the full Las Vegas experience, Las Vegas the show experience these days, you're going to have to buy the DVDs because the DVDs are going to have better quality whooshes. Some of it has to do with the frame rate of our newer TVs. But they're also going to have DVD commentary, behind the scenes stuff, and most of the original music. Most of. Because even on the DVD, on the back, they say some of the music may be varied from the original broadcast. Although, for the most part, I think they're really just talking about the theme song because you only get the Elvis theme in the first episode of each season. But you get the original music. And the original music means so much. Going back to when we were talking about TV shows in the 2000s wanting to be more cinematic, one of the parts of that includes music. This is still at a time where music rights, you could kind of almost ignore them for the most part on TV shows, or at least just do the bare minimum just for this airing because you really weren't thinking about home media. Now, some shows actually did have VHS releases of not even whole seasons because those would be huge blocks. Some shows did. Some shows had whole seasons. Some shows had the whole series. Those would be on sale in like a Time Life type of infomercial that you would see on at 11 to 3 o'clock in the morning, right? And they would be these giant box sets. You'd get a new tape every month or every week. And because VHS was such a cumbersome way of storing media like that, it really wasn't conducive to doing that. DVDs come along and it becomes a lot more conducive. And TV shows start implementing it. And the problem is the rights for the DVDs aren't really thought of. Because the rights for VHSs weren't even really thought of when it came to music. So rights for DVDs when it comes to music weren't really fleshed out or thought of too much, let alone streaming. Or a lot of that strike that we just experienced in entertainment had to do with media rights of the individual. Now, let's have a little rewind back to about 2007, which is, by the way, the strike that killed Las Vegas. Las Vegas was one of those shows that was on the cusp. And it killed Las Vegas because they went on strike at the end of that fifth and final season. And they went on strike at the end of that fifth and final season in part because, or mostly because of DVD rights. The actors didn't know how they were going to get paid for DVDs. And the studios were like, not at all, if we can help it. And they really also did the same thing when it came to music. Now, you had some outliers, like one of the reasons Las Vegas DVDs were so expensive was because they did the same thing that Entourage did, which is they outright paid for the rights, the full asking price for the music, and put them on their DVDs, which made their season DVDs a lot more expensive than a lot of other shows who either took out the music or didn't have the music in the first place. But in the early 2000s, music in television shows meant a lot because we were trying to change the perception of television shows. I mentioned Scrubs initially. Guess what? Scrubs had a lot of licensed music. And when Scrubs is shown on an Amazon Prime without that licensed music, it's not the same show. And when Las Vegas is shown on Peacock without a lot of the licensed music, it's not the same show. Even if it's production music, stuff that's supposed to be in the background, the production music sounds different than the rest of the show. It's not the same show. And you can tell here how important it is. A long time ago, we used to be friends. What were they talking about? What was the one story that didn't get tied up throughout the entire episode? We found the whale. We helped Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. We confronted the exhibitionist. We got the cheater. We talked with Mr. Bunny Shoes. What was the one thread that was left untied? Greg. Danny's friend Greg. Who Danny, his father, and Mary all knew about. We find out in episode 2 that that's Greg. Spoiler alert. The dead guy in the desert. A long time ago, we used to be friends. That ties into your head subconsciously. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, that guy again. Wait a minute. We got to come back to him, don't we? I bet you this means something, doesn't it? I maybe should come back next week so I can watch and see how they tie this up. Also because I like the crew. How are they going to, what does this dead guy have to do with all of them? A long time ago, they used to be friends. But not if you're watching on Peacock. So anyway, that was the Las Vegas pilot. The first episode of one of my, and I'm sure your favorite shows, otherwise you wouldn't have been here, and certainly wouldn't have lasted this long in the podcast to hear me prattle on and on about this show that is clearly near and dear to both of our hearts. I almost immediately fell in love with this show. It really did a lot to encapsulate to me the idea that anything can happen in Vegas. Not just the what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas stuff. Yes, yes, yes. That was another thing that was played to death around that time. But the idea that this place, that there was something about it. There was something about that jewel in the desert. There was something about that oasis in the middle of nowhere. That place. That's that energy, that drive, that mystique that drives so many people to go there year in and year out, despite all the changes, despite all the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad resort fees, and go there year after year, despite losing. Heck, some of the best Vegas stories are losing stories. And trust me, I've got a few bad Vegas stories. You have to. You can't only have good Vegas stories. You have to leave Vegas at least once with some bad Vegas stories. And those are often the best stories you tell. But here, you felt like there were no bad Vegas stories. Even the guy who lost almost all his money, Mr. Bunny Shoes, he went in with nothing and he still came out with something. He still came out a winner because that's this Vegas. That's the Montecito. And with that, that's the Podecito. Folks, if you want to follow the Podecito, you can do so on Twitter. We are at the Podecito. That is at the Podecito, Podecito. I look forward to more episodes like this and better as we roll on into our deep dive into the series known as Las Vegas. If you are associated with the show at all and want to help out the podcast, I would love to interview you. I have I have so many questions and I would love so many different insights from anybody who is associated with the show. And if you could share this podcast, that is maybe the most important thing, is sharing the podcast with other Las Vegas lovers, such as yourself, other family members, people you are introducing to Las Vegas. I wonder how many people are just now being introduced to Las Vegas with it being introduced onto Peacock. I'd love to know that. And I would also love to know, we might as well start now, are you Team Derry or Team DD? Are you for Danny and Delinda, or are you for Danny and Mary? Or neither? Or neither. Did you hate the whole thing? I want to know all that as well. But in the meantime, the in-between time, I appreciate you for coming here and joining me here at the Podecito. And we'll see you next time.